Think of it in terms of buying a house. When you're doing an asset deal, you're buying the house. That is what you're getting. You buy the house and you're getting the house.
And it's empty.
And it's empty. There's nothing in it. You're buying the house and you're buying the land that it's on. A stock deal would be like going in and you're buying a fully furnished as-is house. So you're buying all the furniture that goes along with it. Let's say there's a leak in the roof. You're buying the leak in the roof as well.
Welcome to the Deal Factory, powered by 3PG Advisors. I'm your host, Jeff Harkness. Super excited to have in studio today Chief Operating Officer of 3PG Advisors, Nick Bramblett. Hey, Nick.
Yeah,
awesome
hey,
to be together here in studio.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I wanted to just kind of start with an overview, a little bit of your background for the audience. Tell your story a little bit, how you got started in the world of corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions. Jump in here.
Sure. Yeah. So I started my career, went to Auburn, got a degree in finance from there. And right out of undergrad, I started at a large manufacturing company, Shaw Industries, which is a Berkshire Hathaway subsidiary. Through that, started in your traditional FP&A corporate finance role. And that was really where I got my first taste of M&A. Through that, there were a couple acquisitions that were done all in-house, which were, pretty intriguing at the time. So that's kind of what got my interest started in M&A. So did that for a brief period, and then I went back to law school and business school. So I went to University of South Carolina, and I got my joint JD and international MBA. So heavy finance, focus in finance, and especially on the international side. So did that, and then after graduating, went ahead, took the bar. I knew that I wanted to be in M&A. I wasn't positive that I wanted to be on the legal side of M&A. So, which I think a lot of people can relate
Practicing
to.
attorney, right?
That's
it's
right.
Like, hey, do I want to be an attorney?
That's right. So after that, I joined Ernst & Young here in Atlanta. Started off in their strategy and transactions group, and very quickly kind of leaned towards the tax structuring side of things, given my attorney background. That group was heavily attorneys, just based on tax structuring, and we looked a lot into some of what we'll get into here in a few minutes on once you're going through the deal process, how you structure that most efficiently for a buyer or seller. So I did that for a couple years, and then have been recruited over, joined 3PG and Jeff about a year and a half ago, and it's we've closed.
It's been a good run.
It has been a good run.
It's been
a good run. We have closed probably 15 deals in that time frame, and we're headed towards a strong finish in Q4 here.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I know that I'm excited to get into some nitty-gritty here. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time recently on social media, various webinars with some of the industry sponsors, et cetera. We've been talking a lot about all the activity that we have a front row seat in the mergers and acquisitions world, and specifically this concept around if I'm an owner-operator, and in our world, that's the skilled trades type of world. So it's landscape contracting. It could be, plumbing, HVAC, but a relatively blue-collar, skilled trades business. Right. And I decide that I want to be a buyer and do an acquisition. Sure. And so we get a lot of questions about the legal aspects of getting a deal done, specifically the governing documents that go hand in hand with the various aspects of getting to the closing table. And again, this is from a buyer's perspective. So why don't we start and just discuss at a very high level, typically the different governing documents that are going to be in play on a buy-side deal, or any deal for that matter,
Sure.
But also, too, for the audience's perspective, why legal counsel is important, right? It's not something that, two business guys can get in a room and just hash out.
Right.
It is important to have representation, outside representation. When we do deals at 3PG, you're typically working with outside counsel, but you're very deep in facilitating, given our experience, a good process and what I would call maybe those industry-specific gotchas or watch out for that sometimes if there's general counsel involved, they just don't know the niche like you know the niche.
Right.
So let's start with kind of that basic set of documents, purchase agreement, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, even before we get to the purchase agreement, Jeff, I think, where it really starts is at the letter of intent phase, right? So you've identified a buyer or you've identified a seller, excuse me. You've met with them. You're pretty sure that you want to go down that path. I think the first, kind of set of documents you go toward to is putting a letter of intent together. And typically that is, outlining the terms of the transaction. Now, the benefit of having that letter of intent is at the end of the day, it is non-binding. So you're not binding either parties, but that's basically a good faith effort of showing, hey, here's my intent. You typically lay out purchase price, structure of the deal, and that's a good way to, kind of make sure everyone's on the same page before you start spending real legal dollars, spinning up a purchase agreement and going down that path.
And we like to spend time hashing out the specifics in a letter of intent. It creates certainty to close, and I think oftentimes being on the buyer side, again, you time is of the essence. You want to be very intentional. There are some binding principles in a letter of intent, like exclusivity, that says, "Hey, we're going to get serious about doing a deal. You can't be out talking to every Tom, Dick, and Harry at the same time.
That's right.
Because I'm getting ready to spend some more time and some fees." So anything else unique about the letter of intent? Again, we're very intentional. We like to spend time getting it right versus just a high level. But what else do you think about in the LOI?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you hit on specificity. You want to spend time at that letter of intent phase, getting as specific as possible. Any negotiating that you can do on that front end at the letter of intent phase, is going to minimize the ambiguity on the back end when you're, in the heat of the deal and emotions are higher. A lot of times in the LOI phase, you can eliminate some of that risk by, being agreed to principal terms that you're, eventually going to use to, put together the governing documents, the transaction.
Yep. And I think too, sometimes you and I laugh about this, but exclusivity is important. Hey, you're going to be exclusive with this seller. That seller is going to be exclusive with this buyer. And also, too, the concept of ordinary course. Right. Seller in a particular example is going to continue to run the business like they've always run the business, not because they're close to a deal or getting ready to sign a letter of intent. Suddenly they change their spending habits or how they're handling things related to that. So that's good. Letter of intent, sometimes the acronym that you hear is, hey, we're under LOI. We've even had people say, hey, what's EBITDA? What's LOI? Those acronyms, right? So letter of intent. And then once you're under letter of intent and you've really got a good idea of the structure of the deal, the economics of the deal, the diligence process related to deal, any contingencies and purchase price like a performance payment or an earn-out, rollover equity. We'll talk a little bit about rollover equity today, that sort of stuff. So I think once you get under LOI, now the diligence process begins, and we'll do kind of a separate, as part of the Be a Buyer series, we'll kind of do a separate series of podcasts or informations on due diligence, right? But now it's time working with yourself, working with outside legal counsel, and boom, we're into those, what you and I call transaction docs. Let's talk through a few of those, maybe starting with the purchase agreement.
Yeah. So your purchase agreement is going to be basically the governing doc for a majority of the transaction. So you may have other documents that we'll get into in a minute, such as your employment agreements or your lease agreements, but your purchase agreement is the base for the transaction. So part of that purchase agreement is solidifying the terms that you agreed upon in the LOI, but it's obviously going to be in much more detail. So typically, purchase agreement will start by laying out structure of the deal, and that can be, cash at closing. You alluded to earnout. If there's any other contingencies, that's typically laid out in the kind of opening or intro, and then we get into the representations and warranties of both buyer and seller, which is going to be the meat of the transaction.
Explain a rep and warrant. So we throw those terms around,
right.
and remember, I'm a landscaper or I'm a tree guy or an irrigation specialist.
Right.
How do you really translate what a rep and warrant is?
So a representation, buyer and seller are both going to make representations about the business. These representations can be the most fundamental one from a seller perspective would be that I have all rights to sell this business. From a buyer perspective, for example, you would be making a representation that you have the funds or you have the ability to in good faith buy this business. So when you make these representations, these are going to be what govern any potential indemnities that would rise in a transaction. And when I say indemnities, that would be, hey, if I make a representation that's not true, that would be the potential recourse for a buyer to go back to that seller and say, hey, you represented this to me, and now that we're 6 months post-closing, that turned out to not be true, and what recourse do I have for that?
Yeah, I've always thought of representations and warrants as statements of fact that the seller and the buyer are standing behind.
Right.
Right. Hey, what am I really getting here?
Right.
Right. Where are all the warts? And we see some real simple things like, to your point, do you really own the business, or is there other mysterious shareholders out there that could come back and make a claim? But so the purchase agreement predominantly lays out the details of the deal, but then you get into reps and warrants and disclosure schedules, and then you get into kind of the meat of indemnification.
Right.
What happens if there is something that turns out not to be factual? And you said, Mr. Seller, this was factual.
Right.
Now you get into that risk scenario. So when we're working with sellers, you're typically trying to limit the timing of indemnification, the dollar amounts, et cetera. Fair?
Yep.
So purchase agreement's the governing document.
Yep.
What's the second or third or fourth documents that we typically see in a deal? And if I'm a buyer, I don't want to be out there creating all new docs every time I go do a deal. I mean, consistently you're trying to narrow down and get a good standard set that you can live with as a buyer with your counsel. So purchase agreement will come back to what other documents are kind of staple to that document set that you got to have if you're in the buy-in world.
Yeah, I think the second one would be an employment agreement, especially when you're, most deals that you would be doing on the buy side, you would want the owner or the seller to be staying on, and part of that is making sure that they're in it for the long term and that they're all in on the deal. So the employment agreement is typically would lay out terms of their employment, salary, basic things like that. But more so for the buyer, you're getting protection. Typically, that would be tied to non-solicit, non-compete. So you want to make sure that you're covered from a risk profile as a buyer that, if something does go wrong with your owner or seller, they're not walking away and taking half their client base with them.
Right. That makes sense. So first governing document, purchase agreement. Again, we'll deep dive a little bit more there on the different types, whether it's an asset purchase or a stock purchase. See a lot of employment agreements. And I think employment agreements, as you referenced, certainly you're making a decision as a buyer, am I going to employ that owner, or is that owner going to retire, transition out, start a new career? We also see employment agreements with some of the key executives within an organization, some of their department heads or C-suite executives. So employment agreement, purchase agreement. What's kind of the third staple document that you see?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the third one would be redoing a new lease. So pretty much all of the companies that we work with, by nature of the business that they do, they need real estate. They need real estate to run their operations. They need real estate to house their trucks and equipment. And a lot of times that will be related party owned in a different entity. And I think, there's a lot of nuance there. You hear a lease, and most people would probably think it's as simple as, transferring over a lease to the new party. And it's not always that simple. Something that, we're really, conscious of is making sure that we have, done a lien search and make sure that is there any, collateral tied up in the business. But as we've often found out, it's not always as simple as is there a lien on the business. Right. So we see, cross collateral a lot of times that as a buyer you need to be aware of, because in reality, if there is cross collateral with the business, you could be walking into a situation where they're in breach of a mortgage or a lending document, and then you've closed on it, and technically they're in default on their mortgage.
Yeah, it's a big diligence item, right? Is trying to, if I'm on the buy side and there is a facility that I'm going to look to lease, I'm going to have to do some diligence around, is it encumbered? Right. Is it zoned correctly? Right. There's a whole list of things, but definitely a commercial lease document is very common, particularly for related party, seller-owned real estate. And look, it's not like industrial real estate in the skilled trades world. There's just a bunch of it available, right? And so we always see a commercial lease. And again, we'll come back and kind of deep dive into each of those documents a little bit further. What about a situation where I'm a buyer and my seller doesn't own the property? They're just in a lease with a non-related landlord.
Right.
Typically, what do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, typically that process is a bit easier. We would need landlord consent typically. So there's going to be a new tenant. Right. And so, that is, a lot of times there's a written lease, sometimes they're not. It really depends on geography and relationship there. But that's something as a buyer you want to understand early on. It's not something you want to leave until the week of closing to, be getting out and getting a landlord consent, because as we've seen, sometimes that landlord has an attorney, and then the attorney needs to look at it, and they want to talk about things. And when you start getting 3 or 4 sets of attorneys on things, it's not the quickest process. So it's definitely something that you want to get out in front of earlier in the process. Yeah,
fantastic. So again, letter of intent, purchase agreement, employment agreement, commercial lease. What other documents kind of in that stable of standard documents if I'm looking at being a buyer and not trying to reinvent the wheel every time with a whole new set of documents?
Yeah, I think something that's important, especially if you're, the intent is to do multiple acquisitions, is you need to decide as an owner and an operator whether you want to have, your sellers have skin in the game, whether you want them to be a participating member of your equity in your business. So, and if that is the case, then the governing docs that you would need, the operating agreement of your entity. First of all, you would need to make sure that that's allowed in your business. So you need to make sure that you've done the diligence with, either the attorney that drafted the documents or someone that's specific to being able to lay out what is required to actually grant equity in your business. So that's number one. Once you have that, you would have a set of documents, first being the rollover document. And that a rollover document, when I say that, is referring to rollover equity. So that's essentially saying, I'm going to take an amount of this purchase price that I'm paying you in this transaction.
Let's say it's $1 million.
Yeah.
The deal's $10 million, and I'm going to roll $1 million out of the 10.
Right.
So I'm going to take hopefully $9 million in cash, and $1 million I'm going to invest back in the business with my new buyer. Correct?
That's right. Yeah. So that rollover document is essentially going to lay out the terms and conditions of rolling that $1 million. And from a buyer, you want to make sure that you're as protected as possible there. I mean, there are a lot of different situations that you could get in where you've bought a company. Going back to the purchase agreement, if there is an issue that's arose, let's say you lose a big customer, but you don't want to go the indemnity route. You want to have different buckets that you can go back in to protect yourself. So that rollover document is important. That lays out, the rights that you have as the equity and owner of the business. to potentially have any claims that you would need to have there.
Yeah, and so typically the rollover document also is paired with a standard operating agreement, right? Where the shares, if we go back to our example, it's a $10 million transaction or $1 million transaction for that matter. But out of the $10 million, $1 million is now going to be rolled and invested in the business moving forward under new ownership. So oftentimes, if it's not the first deal, there is a governing document of that LLC or that S corp where that stock's going to be held, and there's some pitfalls there too, right? So, do you see rollover equity and operating agreement? You typically are they paired a lot of times?
Yeah, they typically go together, and I think I want to emphasize too, like it's important to get that right on the first time, because what you don't want to happen is, if you're amending that rollover agreement, that also means you're going back and you're amending the operating agreement, and that's not something you want to do. You don't want to start, amending and restating your operating agreement multiple times. That's one of the few documents that you always want to be upfront about is there's not much wiggle room there, if any. So yeah, the rollover and operating agreement often paired together, and then to the point of you're not amending that operating agreement. Typically, the other one we see is a subscription agreement, and typically the subscription agreement, that is what allows you to subscribe to the existing operating agreement. So that's the governing document that basically binds the two together without having to go back and draft a whole new operating agreement.
Yeah, understood. Again, good stuff. So in summary, and then we'll move off of kind of this high level here and talk about a few pitfalls or specifics. So you're a buyer. You find a business that you want to acquire. You're signing a letter of intent. That LOI or that letter of intent kind of outlays the general understanding of the economics and structure and due diligence that's about to happen. Once you go through your due diligence process, and we'll talk about this at another time, typically business due diligence, accounting and finance, quality of earnings, are the numbers real?
Right.
Legal due diligence, even before you get in the deal docs, as we say. So you get into your letter of intent, you're moving towards, I've finished my due diligence, I'm ready to close on this deal and get into the governing documents, purchase agreement, employment agreement, commercial lease, rollover documents, subscription agreements, operating agreements, again, if we're going to be an investor. And I think one of the things that people ask us all the time is on that non-compete, non-solicit, what do you think market is, non-compete, non-solicit, and where does it show up in those documents? It shows up in a couple places in different docs, doesn't it?
It
non-compete,
does.
non-solicit.
It does.
What's market?
Yeah, I mean, I would say market. A lot of it's depending on size and scale of the business, certainly. I would say typically 2 to 5 years is somewhere market is what we see, and typically that'll be a caveat that it's 2 to 5 years. Or a year or 2 years after termination.
Yeah,
so it's
typically 2 years we see more on the employment side.
Right.
If I'm a seller, it's 5, right?
Right.
Like sometimes 6. You and I are seeing 5 or 6 years.
Right.
If it's an employee matter around don't steal our customers, don't compete, we get into those 1 to 2 year type of scenarios.
Right.
I think that varies state by state, correct?
I agree. And that was something I was going to point out too. Like geography matters there, right? Because we see a lot of different I think the main thing that we would negotiate would be the scope of that non-compete. As far as we've seen them as broad as the whole world, we want to get them as narrow as possible on the sell side, but on the buy side, you want that to be broad.
Yeah, and again, I like if I'm a buyer to work with somebody like yourself and or outside counsel and make sure we got a good. It's part of the toolkit, right? Like we need a set of documents that, by the way, I don't like 50 and 60, 100 page type documents, right? There's a way to protect yourself in doing that. But okay, fantastic. So kind of that overview. Let's talk and pivot a little bit on dialogue that you hear about quite a bit, and probably even more so now in the landscape, turf care, tree care, skilled trades industry that we're spending a lot of time, we're seeing in certain scenarios an asset purchase document. In a lot of scenarios, we're also seeing a stock purchase agreement. And there's always confusion in simplifying what the difference is. There's also, would you agree, heavy opinions from buyers on, I'm only doing asset, and here's why. Or if I do stock, here's the things wide open. So talk from a deal perspective on asset versus stock. And then I want to ask a couple follow-up questions for the audience on, okay, well, how do I know what I should do? And what are some of those business pitfalls that change from a business perspective within the first 3 days after closing a deal of things that I got to get in order? So stock versus asset, like bring it down to a level we can understand.
Yeah, I think a good analogy would be, think of it in terms of buying a house. When you're doing an asset deal, you're buying the house. That is what you're getting. So it would be typically what you would think about when you do buy a house. You buy the house and you're getting the house.
And it's empty.
And it's empty. There's nothing in it. You're buying the house and you're buying the land that it's on. A stock deal, on the other hand, it would be like going in and you're buying a fully furnished as-is house to a degree. So you're buying all the furniture that goes along with it. Let's say there's a leak in the roof. You're buying the leak in the roof as well. So really the difference, asset versus stock is one of the differences is the liabilities that you're taking on. So when you do an asset deal, you kind of have that, our watch, your watch. So when you do an asset deal, you have a clean break. Where as a buyer, any pre-closing liabilities are going to stay with the seller, and any post-closing liabilities are going to be your problem. So that kind of provides the clean break. From the buy side, you also would get a step up in basis a lot of times on an asset deal. So when you close on a transaction,
so if you and I are doing the $10 million deal, you're basically saying how do we allocate $10 million? Talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I mean, every deal is going to have a purchase price allocation that going back to the purchase agreement. And when you close an asset deal, you're going to get step up basis on the fixed assets in the business. So a lot of times for a buyer, that is a preferable method to go about because you get a step up basis. So when you go to sell one day, or if you plan to sell, one, you get to start the depreciation clock over. And two, you get step up in basis, so your basis is higher if you do.
So let me get this straight. So if I'm a buyer and I'm paying $1 million for a company, or $3 million or 10, the number doesn't matter, and it's asset purchase, the more that I allocate, let's use my $3 million to trucks and equipment and hard iron. Let's say on 3 I allocate 2. So of the $3 million in purchase price, $2 million is going to be allocated to trucks and equipment. The remaining $1 million would be goodwill, going concern. That's beneficial for the buyer, correct?
It is. That's correct.
I can start the depreciation clock day one on $2 million. Now on the seller side of things, and it depending on what's important to you as a buyer, but that allocation, the asset allocation on a deal is so important.
It is. From
a tax perspective for both buyer and seller. That makes sense.
It is. And there are ways, Jeff, to get to the same spot for buyer and seller. There are a few you could do. We can talk about this on another one, but you can do what's called an F reorg. You can do a 338 election, and there are ways to get essentially an asset deal for a buyer, a stock deal for a seller, which would get them better tax treatment.
Tax treatment for both parties.
That's right.
What's it going to take to get to the closing table?
Right. And there are gross up mechanisms that can be done to, if that is a sticking point in a deal, there are gross up mechanisms that you can do and calculations that you can do to get a seller to the same spot from a tax walkaway number.
Yeah. So if I'm electing to do an asset purchase agreement versus a stock purchase agreement, there is, both from a practical standpoint and theoretically, a little less risk in an asset deal than a stock deal. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
But if I'm doing an asset purchase deal, there are, outside of legalities, there are negatives or what can be deemed negative business consequences.
Right.
So let's talk about, in an asset purchase deal, what impact that has. Let's start with employees and labor.
Right.
So if I'm doing an asset purchase deal, what's going to happen within day one or day three with that buyer and seller when it comes to employees? Talk through that just a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, from a legal perspective, when you're doing an asset deal, they are buying the assets of the business, i.e. they're not buying the stock of seller. So essentially when you close that transaction, those assets are moving to, typically a
whole new entity.
A whole new entity, whether that be a holding company or whether it be typically a holding company is what we would see, but sometimes it could be, direct to the buyer entity. But nevertheless, they're changing, the assets are changing which business that they sit under. So as part of that process, the employees no longer work for the seller entity. They now work for the buyer entity. So part of that process is you do have to rehire all of the employees to be, basically legally employ the workforce.
So that means could be very cumbersome. Line everybody up, new employee paperwork, fill out I-9s, E-Verify, transfer H-2B, right? There are complexities there.
There are.
And it can be disruptive. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is a fair statement. I think, messaging is important. When you close a deal, you want to make sure that buyer and seller are both aligned in their messaging and how you present it to the employees. If you have certain employees that you are worried about, you want to make sure you're out in front of that, probably even pre-closing to your key guys. To the key guys of the seller, you want to make sure you're having that conversation. But yeah, there is disruption. I mean, I think first and foremost is getting everyone rehired. The worst thing you can do is close a deal and payroll doesn't run that Friday, right?
Yeah, that's a bad day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, anytime you're thinking from the business side around a rehire process, it leads into other considerations. So I'm going to open up a new entity. I'm the buyer, new entity, and I'm going to transfer those assets into my new buyer entity. So let's say Jeff Inc.'s the buyer entity. Now I got to hire everybody in the Jeff Inc. Entity, and all the benefits that were in place, all the insurance that was in place, I got to get that changed around too. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So everything would need to transfer to the successor in the business.
Yep.
Yeah. And there are nuances there. I think, not to go back to the legal doc side of things, but there are ways that you can alleviate some of that pain with doing a transition services agreement.
Yep.
And that's something that you're not really solving the issues, but you're, for lack of a better term, like kicking the can down the road a little bit. It lets you have a little bit of time to breathe, figure things out, and that typically that's a 90 to 120 day period.
Yeah. I think other business concerns, and maybe concerns, it's more eyes wide open, right? Because we're doing at 3PG Advisors, we do plenty of asset purchase deals.
Right. We
do plenty of stock purchase deals. I think some of the size and scope of the transaction comes into play. Who's counsel on either side comes into play, that sort of stuff. But if we're staying on asset purchase and we're opening up a new entity that's going to absorb those assets, we're going to go through a rehire process. We need to get new insurance. We need to get new benefits in place. And as a process, that could be cumbersome. I guess also too, new truck tags. Go down to the DMV and get new tags. And then at some point, depending on how much teeth is in customer contracts, and most of the trade industry, there's a 30-day out in customer contracts, so maybe it's less than an issue. But from a legal theoretical perspective, those contracts are kind of null and void, right?
They are.
So when you go through asset purchase, although you're minimizing some liabilities, and again, there's ways to work through that so that you're not necessarily absorbing liabilities.
Right.
But we see on smaller deals asset purchase. And from the business perspective, if you're doing an asset purchase deal, you need a plan on transitioning employees. You need a plan on transitioning insurance and benefits. You need a plan or have to understand the cost of retitling your trucks and equipment and getting new tags,
Transfer
right?
taxes on
There's
that.
the transfer taxes. There's some thoughts around, okay, well, what's my customer communication going to be with the legalities of my contracts? And again, we've seen different ways with legal counsel to navigate that. But I think sometimes if you're in the audience, you just think it's simple to pick stock or pick asset.
Right.
It becomes it's just not that simple,
right?
In that world. So talk about stock purchase a little bit versus asset. We typically see stock purchase probably more on larger deals. And it also, the name doesn't have to change.
Right.
There's less disruption from the business side. So when you see an asset purchase document versus stock, is it fair? How much meatier is the stock purchase deal? It's longer, right?
It is.
There's a lot more stuff. So talk about that.
Yeah, right. Because going back to the house analogy, you're buying it as is. You're buying all the furniture in the house. You're buying, the leak in the roof. So you're buying all the historic liabilities of the seller at that point. So to your point, those documents are typically a bit longer because what you want to do from a buyer perspective, you want to have. You want to make sure your representations are, from a buyer perspective, as broad as possible to, carve out the liability, the successor liability of that, and likewise, you want your disclosures to be overly broad as well. So, I think that's a fair point. And to your point about, typically the bigger deals we see our stock purchase, it does become There is a point where it is logistically challenging in the industry that we play in to your point, retitle 500 or 1,000 employees and retitle 500 trucks. Like it does become a logistical challenge and cost, right?
Yeah, cost, yeah.
Right. So, I think there is that aspect of it to consider. And then, like we talked about earlier, from a seller perspective, they're getting capital gains treatment on a stock deal as well. So, they prefer that from the sell side. On the buyer side, though, you're not getting that step up in basis. So pretty much everything, starts over as a zero basis in that company.
And I think it's case by case. I think our messaging, anytime you're getting involved in your standard set of documents, one, if I'm an operator and a founder and a business owner and think I can do buy-side deal without legal counsel or representation, even a deal group like 3PG to quarterback things, that's just a bad decision, right? It's hard to do that. Let's unpack a little bit some general concepts around the purchase agreement that always come up that I think create confusion, and we started talking about them a little bit. Explain disclosure schedules with reps and warrants. Talk us through, maybe let's talk about a fundamental rep and a non-fundamental rep, and then walk through a little bit, maybe an example of a disclosure that would be made in each of those. I know I'm putting you on the spot for that.
No problem. So fundamental rep are your kind of exactly what they sound like. They're the fundamental reps of the business that, the way I usually think about it is they're the reps that would be catastrophic to the deal, basically, if aren't true, such as, I own 100% of the outstanding stock of the business when it turns out you have a silent partner.
Don't.
Right.
You really don't.
Right. And so those are the reps that are typically the most broad, the most basic.
Is tax a good one?
Tax, yeah. I haven't paid my taxes in 5 years. Like that's a fundamental rep. So, those are really the big ticket items that would have the most liability for a buyer. And typically those are the ones that you want the broadest scope. You want the longest, statute of limitations, and typically fundamental reps are exactly that. They go as far as the statute of limitations allow typically.
Yeah, and statutes typically run how many years?
It's state dependent, but 8 to 10 years sometimes.
6, 8, 10.
Yeah, 6, 8, 10 years, depending on the state.
Yeah.
So those are your fundamental reps that which are negotiable, by the way. Like that, we on every deal we would negotiate fundamental versus non-fundamental reps, and that's actually something that you can get into in the LOI phase, with the caveat that you can't always lock people down in LOI based on that.
So if we take a fundamental tax rep that a seller representation that a seller's making, it says, hey, you've paid all your taxes. There's no tax liens. You filed all your tax returns, corporate returns, payroll tax returns. And are you saying that if it's a fundamental rep, typically that time frame could be 5, 6, 7, 10 years?
That's right.
And is that, unless there's a disclosure there made by the seller, as a buyer, I can come back within that time frame and say, hey, 3 years later, we got this notice from the IRS or something from an employee where you didn't do what you said you did from a tax perspective. That gives me a lever to do what? What happens in that scenario?
Yeah, so that's where you have the ability to make an indemnity claim. Now, I want to point out, the nuances. You have to be damaged, right? So you do have to show that there was damages there.
You can't be having a bad day and just say, I want some money back.
That's right. That's right, yeah. So make sure you're comfortable with the deal is what we're saying there. But no, you can pull an indemnity lever. That's one lever. Another thing that we were talking about earlier, why you want to have your rollover and subscription documents tied is, if there is, for some reason, let's say you go to the seller and say, hey, there's $500,000 liability, there's $500,000 of liability, and for some reason they don't have $500,000. You want to have the ability to go via rollover, subscription, or if there's a earn out in the deal, whatever it may be, you want to have as many levers as possible as a buyer, that if there was something that was not disclosed, or if there was something, a historic liability, known or unknown, maybe it was unknown, that it's still a historic liability that you didn't create.
So fundamental representations are statements of fact made by seller and buyer, for that matter, but more seller, right? That says, hey, this is true. And if it's not true in a purchase agreement, how do you remedy that? Like, I do have some tax stuff due, or I do have a warranty claim, or I do have a partner. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so you make a disclosure, right? That's the other part of representations and warranties is you say this statement of fact is true except for this, and that's where the disclosure schedules come in. So, if to your point, if there is something that you can't make a rep honestly about, then you disclose it, and it's one of the few times that over disclosure is a good thing. You want to make sure that all known liabilities are out on the table, because essentially you're carving that out in the indemnity world. So you want to make sure as a buyer that you push pretty hard on as many of the the representations as you go through diligence. Keep that cap on as you go into the legal docs.
What's a non-fundamental rep? So let's use customer contracts or customers, right? We see. Or sometimes now, more so now, employee practices. So how is a non-fundamental statement of fact different than a fundamental in a purchase agreement?
Yeah, so non-fundamental reps are the reps that will have a specified term of, basically you have coverage for, let's say, 12 to 18 months. And these are the reps that typically are more, to your point, it's labor practices, it's environmental, it's, conflict of laws, it's things like that. And those are essentially the reps that are still important nonetheless, but they're not your fundamental reps that if you make a representation that turns out not to be true, it's probably not going to be fatal to the business. So typically those, in turn, and in fairness, those don't have as stringent of a survival period as a fundamental rep. So, as a buyer, you would want to carve that out still, as long as you could get, 18 to 24 months would probably be preferable on the buy side. But those are things that after that time period expires, you do own those liabilities. And so, on the labor front, for example, after that 18 or 24 months, has expired, you're going to own the liabilities based on your, labor practices.
Let's pivot, because I have trouble sometimes. People ask this all the time. how do you define in practical or layman's terms indemnification? Like, what does it really mean? Because as you've talked about in a purchase agreement, you got all the economics, you got statements of facts, reps and warrants, and then there's this, I guess it is indemnification clawback rights. Like, how do you describe indemnification from a practical perspective?
I would say, simply put, it's kind of how breaches are compensated, right? So if there is a breach of that representation, it's buyer's compensation for you breaching that.
So something turned out, you said it was true,
right?
And it turns out it's false, and there's some negative economic impact to me, the buyer.
Right.
If you're my seller.
Right.
So typically, what do you see, or what are you negotiating in that indemnification world?
Yes, I mean, like we touched on earlier, survival periods for those reps is one thing. The other things you would look to cap liability, at least from the seller side. Typically fundamental reps, so your essential reps that you're making about the business, typically those are uncapped. And typically your non-fundamental reps typically have a cap. I think from the buy side, or really both sides, it's not uncommon to see a cap of the total purchase price of the transaction, and you would want to be comfortable with that level as a buyer. So I think you negotiate those two things, and then there's also something that we typically look at and negotiate: tipping basket or deductible basket.
Hey, don't call me.
Right. Yeah.
Don't
right.
call me unless it's more than $30,000.
That's right. Yeah.
So kind of deductible type concept.
That's right. Yeah. There are a couple different methods you can go there. Yeah.
A couple things that I know comes up all the time from a practical perspective is, how do I make a decision if I'm an owner-operator and I'm going to be a buyer? What are some of the things I need to consider if I'm going to pick a law firm or an attorney to help me, right? And maybe you've dictated this to me, if we use medicine a little bit, the difference between if I got a heart issue,
right,
calling an orthopedic guy versus a cardiac specialist.
Right.
What are some of the things that, if I'm an owner-operator and I'm looking to have somebody on my team as a legal advisor, talk through just some things there that I guess you and I would say we want to check the box.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think number one, you hit on it. You want an M&A attorney, right? You want someone that has been in the field and has done transactions. I think a lot of times when we have clients engage us, their initial instinct is, my buddy that did my corporate docs, or
I do real estate,
right,
but I can do your deal,
right? Or
this one's good too. I'm a generalist,
right?
And I only have 2 people in my office, but I can do your $10 million transaction.
That's right.
I'm obviously kidding.
Yeah.
But we've heard that before.
We have,
and that gets frustrating.
Yeah, it does.
And it's not a good scenario. So what about expectation of just fees, right? I think. And remember, at 3PG Advisors, we're acting from the business side, working with our seller, being the quarterback. You do have a law degree. We're not trying to practice law. We're working with outside legal counsel, but we're that quarterback and facilitator to move through. Fees on the legal side, low end's probably what, high end, just in range. Obviously, deal size, complexity matters,
right,
but set an expectation for a buyer that's listening in theory.
Yes. I mean, I think in the, rising complexity of the environment that we live on based on, environmental, legal, labor, et cetera, I think low end probably 75 now is probably is best case scenario for doing a deal. And then, it can go upwards of 100 to 150, 200, 250 grand, even depending on the size and complexity of the deal. I think a lot of factors come into play there. Certainly size and specialty of the firm. full service firms that offer, tax structuring, labor and employment review, things like that. Those can all drive up legal
Sometimes
costs.
commercial real estate.
Commercial
right, in the
real
lease.
estate, yes.
They're probably the big three, right?
Those are.
Somebody that has a practice that's focused on mergers and acquisitions, and then maybe some experience or specialty in employment, tax, real estate, right? Those tend to be the kind of the big three.
Yep, yeah. I would agree. So you're on average, you're probably somewhere in the 125 to 150 is probably a good average on most of the deals we work on. But when you think about, it's all those governing documents that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I think too, if you get to a standard set of documents that make sense, those fees could come down. I think it's unrealistic being a buyer that, I'm going to spend less than $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and that includes, in my mind, some legal diligence too that has to happen outside of documents. But hopefully, you and I we're past the days, given the size of the deals that we're doing, where we're dealing with my brother-in-law that is an attorney, or I've never done a deal, but I know real estate. Right. It is similar to medicine.
Yeah, and I think too another factor just on legal cost is who's on the other side, and that matters too. If you have another M&A specialist, typically things go a lot smoother than if you have a real estate attorney, let's say that hasn't negotiated a purchase agreement before. That can really drive up legal cost, as traditionally, it's both parties redline the document back and forth as you negotiate.
Figuring out along the way. Right. Figuring out along the way. Right. So, that makes sense. Well, let's close with this. If you look at the current environment under the new administration, obviously there's some headwinds. There's also a new narrative out there. Do you want to talk a little bit about just kind of what we're seeing in the skilled trades around labor compliance and what complexities that's adding to due diligence and deals that maybe wasn't in place in prior years? By the way, let's make this disclosure. You have to be a compliant business.
That's right.
Right. If you're looking to be a seller or even be a buyer, there's no way to fake it till you make it or circumvent compliance, right? That's how you go to jail.
That's right. right? That's right.
And doing that. But just from what we're seeing in the industry, again, kind of that skilled trades, blue collar, facility services world, we're seeing a lot more diligence under the Trump administration and some of their new policies.
That's right. Yeah, we're seeing hypersensitivity, to Jeff's point about labor compliance as it relates to I-9s, as it relates to supporting documents around that, H-2B labor and the complexities around that. We're also seeing sensitivity around the adjacent parole and immigration programs that some of the other countries have in place. So, yeah, I think it just went from probably a fourth or fifth priority as you check through your diligence work stream to now it's 1B right behind your quality of earnings, which is your finance and accounting diligence. There's hypersensitivity around that, and it's something that buyers are asking for day 2 and day 3 of the transaction. So, it's something that you want to have buttoned up on the buy side, and you want to have a plan in place, right? If there is, it's not always that there is there's a true issue with the employees. A lot of times it's a non-compliance issue. So you want a path forward and a game plan of how you're going to fix those.
Yep. That makes sense. Well said. Well, listen, excited for you to be in to the studio.
Yeah.
It's been fun.
It has.
And I think from the audience perspective, again, as we're on kind of this series of talking about what it takes to be a buyer, I would want the messaging to be, one, don't do it alone. You got to get expertise. It is important to have a quarterback on the deal side, and it's certainly important that your deal team and your deal advisor can work really well with a competent attorney that has the knowledge and the understanding of what it takes to get to the closing table, the importance of getting things right with a letter of intent and what's binding, what's non-binding. And then if I'm going to be a buyer that's scaling and growing, to get kind of a standardized set of documents, purchase agreement, We'll talk a little bit more at a separate time on employment and kind of different levers to pull within the employment world. Commercial lease is very common. Operating agreements, rollover documents, right? Those are kind of the tools to the trade if you're going to be out there acquiring companies. So, like I said, great to be together.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming on the Deal Factory.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see everybody soon.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Nick.